be lady, just like the teacher, remember?
Yeah.
There we go. I'd like to introduce to you Sherry Pringle. It's from Napanee. My hometown. So I have lots of stuff, or lots of things here about Sherry. And if I make a mistake, Sherry's my backup. So there might be a quiz in here for me. So
Don't ask
make
me
sure,
any numbers.
make sure I get it right. Okay. In May of 2010, so that'll get us started, Sherry's first book, All the Ship's Men, HMCS of Athabasca's Untold Story by Vanwell Publishing, debuted at Juno Beach Center in France, along with Sherry's cover paintings and an Athabascan display she organized and sent to France to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Canadian Navy. So she's a busy lady, she's all over the place, hasn't stopped since. So I'm not going to go through them all, but if the Navy hosted a coming out book type thing for her. And then I like this one because it's my favorite day. On Remembrance Day, but it was 2015, her book, Extraordinary Women, Extraordinary Times, Canadian Women of World War II, was published. And here's my real quill, because I know of a couple of others that have done this as well. Her grandson inspired her first children's book. I think it was your first children's book. Grandpa was a ram. I haven't read that book, but it should be interesting. And let's see the next ones. In 21, second edition of All Ship's Men, with 18 additional stories, was published. And she has also a historical novel, All the Ship's Men. No, yeah, not that. Tell the King is her historical novel. So she's dipping into lots of history, but still bringing in her family with the children's book. And Sherry is a member of the Writers Union of Canada. So when she's not writing, and she's not coming and sharing her talents with us, she's a painter. So, anything else you'd like to add? That's fine too. And we're anxious to hear
Thank you
your
so much.
presentation.
I'm going to turn this around so I can see your face, but then I'm obstructing the slides, am I?
Nope.
I'm doing that. Can you see me in the back? Okay, well, it's not important that you see me, but you can hear my stories. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you. And thank you for your chosen profession, because you've probably touched a lot of kids. And you probably are realizing this now as you're a retiree, and you come upon people that you know, look,
Yes.
So I've got two quick stories to tell you about people, teachers from my hometown that I ran into, because I live where I went to school. So I saw these women growing up, of course. And what I'm doing now involves two things. It involves history, of course, in English, of course, but it also involves France, because I've spent a lot of time and effort into researching stories that took place in France. So it so happens that in my town, my history teacher, one of my history teachers, was Beth Alkenbrack. And way back when I was writing the first book, I ran into Beth and I said, Beth, I know it's 40 years too late, but can I please have my A+ in history now? And she said, why? And I told her what I'd done. Well, she was quite excited about that. And then I ran into my French teacher not so long ago, a few years ago. And I ran over to her to say, Mrs. Salisbury, you might not think I was paying attention in French, but I have to tell you something. I have delivered a speech in French in France. Well,
Oh.
so, you know, there are late bloomers out there. So as a child, how did I get started? As a child, I was mesmerized by a photograph in the family photograph album. And he was dressed in a naval uniform. And my mother told me, he was my 19-year-old uncle. And he was killed when a ship went down off the coast of France. So a series of events led me to embark on a writing journey to uncover all I could about his story and those of his crewmates. The culmination of my endeavor ended in the book entitled All the Ship's Men, as you were just told. And then a second edition came out just in 2021 with 18 new stories. So during the interview process, I called to speak to a gentleman who had been a shipmate in Victoria and got his wife on the phone. And I detected a Scottish accent. So she proceeded to tell me that when their ship was in port in Scotland, she met her husband Douglas and then got married. And when his ship sailed and sunk, Douglas was taken prisoner of war. And she said, I just took the train to London and I got a job outside London in communications. So I got very excited. And I asked her if she'd been a decoder at Bletchley Park.
Oh.
And she wouldn't answer yes or no. That was the end of the conversation. So we have to keep that in mind because I'll come back to that. Excuse me. So that led me to wonder, what exactly were the women of World War II doing? I mean, we know about the men. I mean, they've been immortalized for their bravery in books and in movies. But what were the women doing? I knew, of course, there were service women. What did that mean? What does a service woman do? And I knew of nurses, of course, and decoders had become a part of our common day language now. We know about the decoders, and it's become a familiar word. So after a chance visit to Bletchley Park in England, where I met a former decoder, I knew I had to write about the women's roles and experiences during the war. I had no idea what I was going to find. I didn't know what was out there to find. And because of my infatuation with the life of Canadian-born Sir William Stevenson, a spy called Intrepid, and what I had read about him, plus the decoding aspects of Bletchley Park and my suspicion about that woman, I started to think about the folks that were at Camp X between the border of Whitby and Oshawa and training people there as well. But because of that, I knew that there must be a Canadian female spy out there somewhere. But you know what? I couldn't find one. If I was looking in the US or Great Britain, I could find all kinds of them, but nobody in Canada. So I had to start without the spy. So I even joined 2 chat groups. The OSS Society, which is the Office of Strategic Services, which is was the precursor to the CIA. And I also joined the SOE, which stands for Special Operations Executive, and that's based out of England. And they were responsible for training spies to be dropped behind enemy lines. So Canadian female agents just seemed to be non-existent. But I found out through the SOE group that we did have one. She was a British lady who'd married a French Canadian. Her name was Sonia Butt, and she married a chap by the name of Guy D'Artois. Both of them were SOE agents. And they were last known to have settled in Montreal post-war, but I couldn't find her. So since I could not find Sonia, I moved on to my very first interview, which took place in January of 2011. And it was for a decoder that had been at Camp X. And this gal, Evelyn Davis, was living in Tottenham. And my adventure has just started to begin. So now this time, I want you to imagine that you are with me, because this was the most exciting journey of my life. And I want you to come with me, and I want you to think along the lines of, what questions will we ask, and just think that you're there with me when I'm asking them questions. Failure is not an option. There is no failing in this process, because even if I cannot find a publisher, I will still have documented personal experiences to donate to the War Museum in Ottawa. So I have no idea what there's out there to discover, but I want you to join me, and we'll open the doors and see what stories we're about to hear. So, in lieu of a spy, she was a spy of sorts. This is Marion de Chastelain, an American by birth. Marion Walsh lived in Romania with her family, where she met and married George de Chastelain, working there in the oil industry. Now, Chaz, as he was known, became a special operations executive, that SOE that I told you about, and he was dropped behind enemy lines not once, but twice. He was actually taken prisoner. Marion then took her son John, now Canada's only former 4-star general, and her daughter Jacqueline back to the States, to New Jersey, where her family was from. And while she was there, she was contacted by none other than Sir William Stevenson. And she was invited to work for SIS, which is Secret Intelligence Service, in the New York Rockefeller Center. She was a linguist. She spoke several languages. So she became the manager of an American spy called Cynthia, who was tasked with stealing highly sensitive documents on the Vichy Navy from the embassy in Washington, D.C. Marion was living in New York, and she would be called to Washington to translate all the messages that Cynthia stole. And then she would leave, go back to New York, and Cynthia would get them back into the safe before they were detected as being missing. So, to my knowledge, nothing ever happened in that light. And so when the U.S. entered the war, after Pearl Harbor, the Vichy embassy was closed in Washington, D.C. So now, where did I get my information from? I don't even know where I'm starting from, let alone where am I going to find this. So the first thing was networking with friends and family. And, until you really network amongst the people that and they're sitting on a wealth of information, but we don't think to ask. But so one woman would recommend another woman that would and they all said, my story is nothing. You should talk to my daughter's mother-in-law, and things like that. I placed an ad in the Legion magazine that went across Canada, and I was able to find some women out there. And of course, there was books, magazines, chat groups, museums, archives, and documentaries. And the War Museum archives in Ottawa provided valuable leads. Now, anybody here heard of Molly Lambeau-Back? She is a name that some Canadians know. So I said to the men in Ottawa, okay, now this is what I'm doing. Can you recommend some stories for me? And they said, oh, do you know about Molly Lambeau-Back? No. Well, this is a terrible thing to admit when you're an artist, but Molly Lambeau-Back was Canada's only official war artist. There were others, but they did not have that designation. And she was not sent to London, England, until ceasefire was declared in May of 1945. And Gladys Arnold. So then he said, well, what about Gladys Arnold? Well, who is Gladys Arnold? Did you know or even suspect that Canada might have had a female war correspondent back in the wartime? They did, and she was it. And she would have to stand in line behind all the men, correspondents from all over the world, and all the other women from other countries. She would be the last on the totem pole to be able to get her messages home. And she grew up in Saskatchewan, found herself working in London and Paris for the Free French movement. And she fled to Paris the very day the Nazis were invading. And then this other lady, Lieutenant Kay Gilmore. She was a nurse. So nursing sisters Kay Gilmore and May Water, just the two from Canada, there were lots of nurses, but not on this kind of a mission, were sent to Hong Kong. And they happened to be in Hong Kong on Christmas Day when the Japanese arrived. They were taken into custody as prisoners of war, which is, you can only be classified as a prisoner of war if you have a military title. Like we know about Japanese camps and Holocaust survivors, and they were prisoners, but they were not prisoners of war as denoted by the title. And because they were lieutenants, and so they had the title. The two Canadian nurses witnessed the most horrifying of atrocities and lived to tell the tale. They were exchanged in a release. They were released in an exchange that was carried out in September of 1943. So it's not always smooth sailing. There are myths to bust, and there's surprises to uncover, and there's disappointments. So one myth that I was told, and probably you've heard this along the way too, was that aviators, like female aviators, and I was told that the women ferried planes across the Atlantic. But that is not true. Not true of Canadian women. And some of them went to Britain and joined Air Transport Auxiliary, or ATA, and they ferried planes from the manufacturers to the troop encampments. And towards the end of the war, they actually ferried the planes across the channel into camps behind enemy lines. I was told there were no doctors. The nurses that I found said, no, there were no female doctors in World War II down here. And they were wrong. And that lead came from a curling pal when we were curling at a bonspiel in Montebello, who said, hello, I know there were, and because I work at Women's College Hospital, and that's where the archives are, I'll get you the information. Unfortunately, they were gone, and so I had no personal stories to add. Their stories are fairly clinical, just matter of fact, as to what they had done. And although they were few and far between, one was a psychologist who was stationed in France, but they kept the other women doctors in London. Now the nurses, of course, were all there behind enemy lines, but not female doctors. Now this lady was a great surprise. Elsie McGill was Canada's first female electrical engineer graduate from the University of Toronto in 1927. After graduation, she went to Michigan, where she got her degree in aeronautical engineering, becoming the first female aeronautical engineer in North America. And she was Canadian. But while she was there, she contracted polio, and she was never able to fulfill her dream of flying. However, Elsie did design a plane, a Maple Leaf trainer plane. And so that was that helped fill the void, I guess. And during wartime, she oversaw the plant production of 1,400 Hurricane Hawker planes in Thunder Bay, formerly Fort William, earning her the title Queen of the Hurricanes. I had 2 Holocaust survivors that I interviewed, And this, they're just so amazing. You know, you're blown away, and you're trying not to show your emotions because they have a big story to tell. But she was from Prague, and during the war, the Zionists had a movement to take 150 teenage kids, age 14 to 16, and billet them with families in Denmark. Now, Anne was an only child, so she said she remembers hearing her parents arguing over her mother didn't want her to go. And her father said, "It's like a burning house. Those who can must get out, do what they have to do to save themselves." So at the train station, the Zionists gave them all a little string of silver bells. And that was so that when they were in exile, literally, but under the protection of the Danes, that when they felt down and they felt alone, they could look at their silver bells and know there were 149 others in the same boat. So then the Nazis invaded, and they had to whisk the kids out. They were the Nazis knew about these kids, and they had to whisk them out in the middle of the night on a sardine vessel, crossing the Atlantic to Sweden, dodging U-boats. So they remained there until the end of the war. Catherine McIntyre went to Queen's, right here in Kingston. She was in her 4th year, and she woke up one day and thought, "What am I doing here? There's a war raging, and I need to be doing something." So she joined the RCAF WD, which stands for Women's Division, was sent to Gander, Newfoundland, where she became an air traffic controller. I can sort of start feeling myself like really an underachiever, but you read about all these things these women did. And Eva Konopatchki. At the age of 16, Eva was a freedom fighter in the Warsaw Uprising. A danger lurked around every corner of her path as she ran through the rubbles of war, armed with a handgun and a grenade. She was awarded the highest and most prestigious medals for heroism that Poland has to offer. Now, I told you that there was going to be disappointments along the way. So one of my disappointments was a woman who had been a 14-year-old ambulance driver. So they didn't care that you were 14 or wouldn't have had a driver's license. All that mattered was you were courageous enough to do it, and you were capable of driving a vehicle. So she became an ambulance driver in war-torn England. Now, she asked to see me after I'd gotten her story all ready to go. So I went to Toronto to meet with her, and she starts regaling me with tales of being engaged to the 4th in line of the Spanish throne. I could hardly wait to get out of there because I couldn't wait to write all of the stamps. And then she had pictures, she had photographs, and then she tells me, "Oh, but you can't write about that." Oh, well, why not? Well, because nobody jilts the royalty. And she had never gone back. She stayed in Canada, and she'd broken off her engagement. So anyway, she said nobody jilts the family, and someone is liable to recognize me. So she doesn't have a story like everybody else with the photograph because she wouldn't give it to me. And at the War Museum, this was another disappointment that ended well. The War Museum gave me a lead of a gentleman who had been on a troop ship going to Hong Kong with Kay Gilmore. So I called him and I asked if I could interview him, and he said, sure, that would be fine. So I told him when I was coming and whatnot, and so the night before I was to go to Ottawa to interview him, I called to say I was coming, and 10 o'clock in the morning or whatever. And he seemed a little baffled by my phone call. And after a bit of nudging, he chirped up and said, well, oh yes, Kay and I were best of friends. I know everything there is to know about Kay. So at the designated time, I rang the doorbell and was shown inside by a caregiver. Now, the gentleman I came to talk to had not only forgotten who I was or why I was there, but had no recollections of Kay Gilmore. So with my shoulders drooping, I head for the front door, and the caregiver stops me and gives me a card with a phone number on it and says, call this number. This gentleman was on the ship with Kay as well. So it came out fine. So on to Marion Orr. So she was one of the ATA pilots that I told you about. And as I had said, although no Canadian women ferried planes across the Atlantic, there were 5 of them, 5 Canadians, intrepid flyers who went to London to fly Air Transport Auxiliary. And so I found myself in Ottawa at the archives, my hands gloved, and I'm gently leafing the pages to Marion's logbook. So whereas males flew 1 or 2 planes, the ATA pilots had to fly all 99 varieties.
Oh.
And the women had no instrumentation training. And they frequently sat on the tarmac reading the manual to take off.
Oh, yeah.
So as I turned the pages, I gasped at the variety of planes Marion Orr piloted. She flew Hurricanes and Fairchilds and Mosquitoes and a number of other varieties. But her favorite for maneuverability was the Spitfire. And at war's end, Marion had logged a total of 700 flying hours on 67 varieties of planes. Wow. Upon returning to Canada, there were no jobs for female pilots. Hello. So Marion started her own flying school north of Toronto. So I had a heck of a time finding nurses. Now, of course, that's the first thing you're thinking about, nurses. And I'd only maybe chalk it up to the fact that because of the training, they might have been a couple of years older than some of the other ladies who had signed on. And I did have trouble, but I came upon Hallie Sloan, who was a career Army nurse. And she had been awarded the Order of Canada in 2004 by former Governor General Adrian Clarkson. She served behind enemy lines in the Bayeux region of France, where because the cots were low, she and the other nurses performed their duties while kneeling on the ground. Bea Corbett was a Kingston girl, and there were lots of Kingston women and lots of local women, but there were also women from coast to coast that I got to interview. But it was really cool having Bea and her friends here in Kingston. So off the coast of Vancouver, on Gordon Head Island, decoder Bea Corbett, a Canadian Wren, deciphered messages from Japanese ships in the Pacific. Bea and the other decoders were trained in a syllabic alphabet or bridge language known as Romaji. And it was a newly devised language which Romanized the Japanese dialect using the application of Latin. And it was drilled into their heads to take the secrets to the grave. She received the Bletchley Park Commemorative Badge for the British government right here at Kingston's HMCS Cataraqui in 2016. I didn't know we had occupational therapists that long ago, but we did. And Beth Robinson was one, and Beth is a Kingston gal. And she was a therapist at St. Anne de Bellevue in the St. Lawrence River, just upriver from Montreal. So the returning troop ships would sail up the St. Lawrence and deliver their men, both physically and mentally broken, many with post-traumatic stress disorder, of course, which at the time they called shell shock, to St. Anne de Bellevue Hospital. Every man was individually assessed, and a program was specifically designed for their needs. Miriam Mitchell was also a Kingston lady, and she was with the Canadian Red Cross in London. And I had heard from everybody what it was like when the war ended, the celebrations and whatever that was going on. But nobody quite brought it home like Miriam did. She described in great detail the silence and the darkness that had befallen the city, decimated by incessant bombing for 6 long years. In the absence of light, the sense of sound became heightened. Miriam became expert at identifying footsteps on the pavement. She could tell if the pedestrian was a man, woman, or child, whether they were a civilian or wore military boots. On VE Day, the church bells rang out, including those from Westminster Abbey. And she said the air just rang and it was chiming and nonstop jubilance. And Miriam said, people had gotten so used to living in the dark, they had forgotten how dazzling London could be. Another Kingston man. Anne Bryden was stationed in Halifax. Now she was a Wren, and she was the lady who received the first word in Halifax that the war was over. But it was at nighttime, and she had to go to bed on that, and she was told not to tell a soul. And she had to wait until the news broke in the morning. And because of her Dutch heritage after the war, she was asked to greet Dutch immigrants at Halifax Harbor and welcome them to the new home. So remember at the start of my talk, I mentioned a woman from Scotland who was married to a Canadian sailor whom I suspected as being a Bletchley decoder. So I contacted her daughters as the book was nearing publication. And I asked them, would you please ask your mom one more time, did she or did she not work at Bletchley Park? Because I had given her knowledge. I had acknowledged her on the first page of my acknowledgments without using her name because I didn't have permission to use her name. Did she or did she not work at Bletchley? And the answer came back. All Mother would say was that Bletchley Park was a huge estate with many outbuildings on the property. Yeah, my hunch was right. She had been a decoder. And remember, I also told you about trying to track down Sonia Butt, who was an SOE agent, last known to be living in Montreal. Well, serendipity led me onto the path of her son, Bob. And Sonia, who had been dropped behind enemy lines 9 days before the Normandy invasion, to instruct the resistance in the art of sabotage. She's gone now, but I managed to have Bob interviewed about his mother at Juno Beach. And although her story was too late to be included in the book, her story is now part of the 4-part documentary Heroines in the Storm, based loosely on my book. It took 4.5 years of research, interview, and writing for 61 stories of women's involvement in World War II. Now there are other stories, snippets of here and there that I could maybe assemble into introduction to a chapter. Some at first glance might appear to be insignificant. Well, let me tell you, they are all significant. Even if they describe marching in a parade square, they tell us what it was like to cross the Atlantic in a convoy, or driving an ammunition truck during blackout over bombed out roads. And how about leaving your family and your friends behind to come to Canada as a war bride? All of these stories are significant. One in particular tugs at my heartstrings. Now I got to tell you, this is where I get emotional. I tried this. A friend said, okay, if you just read it out loud and, the crying will diminish. And I did that and didn't. So I'm telling you this anyway because anyway, here it goes. It involves a British woman with children in tow crossing the Atlantic at war's end as a war bride to join her husband, who'd come out. He was a Dunkirk survivor, and he'd come out ahead to find a place for them to live. So now we have to imagine we're on a train with Ida and her children. And the train starts to slow, and the conductor announces Kingston. Kingston! Lo and behold, we're at Kingston. The children all run to the window to see Daddy awaiting them on the platform. And they're all yelling and pointing, there's Daddy, there's Daddy. And in her diary, she says, oh, heavenly day, we really had arrived, ready to start our new life. Our country is a land of immigrants. We welcomed thousands post-war. We offered them freedom and safety when they had been to hell and back, and were now ready to settle in a young country, offering them a new life. When all was said and done, the women I encountered and the thousands that they represent stepped up to the plate to contribute to the war effort through service work, factory work, growing crops in the fields, keeping the home front operational, to name but a few of their impressive contributions. At war's end, they were obliged to give up the jobs that had given them pride and fulfillment. They had reached beyond their comfort zone and ventured well ahead of their time. They went back home, some to complete their university life that had been interrupted, some to be retrained, and some to resume their life as homemaker. Service women all said they would do it again in a New York minute. It had been the most exciting time of their life. Over the years, we have lost a lot of these women. In fact, just this past Friday, one former Wren, Betty Sheik, best friend of Joyce Smith, and a tightly knit group of Kingston Wrens, whose stories are included in Extraordinary Women, celebrated her 100th birthday. So close was this group that the Smith girls all visited Betty on her special day. The following day, her family surprised her with a personal performance by the Rob Roy Band outside in the parking lot. Can you imagine? They'd come to play for me. 2 days later, Betty slipped quietly away in her sleep to be reunited with her beloved family and her friends on the other side. Their stories are now part of our history. This is the legacy that they have left us. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions, anybody? Wow. The stories are unbelievable. Of folding parachutes and having to sign them. Of just all kinds of things that you never would have thought of in a million years. And, I just tell everybody, ask about your aunt or your granny or somebody that's from somebody that knows. Ask those questions because they'll be forever lost. And we take for granted that, this sweet Aunt Betty, we didn't, she was good for chocolate chip cookies and all those wonderful lemonades and things that she could bake. We didn't know what they were doing, what they were really doing for us.
You said signing parachutes.
So the parachutes were, of course, all had to be folded in a specific manner so that they'd open right.
Oh.
They all had to sign the parachutes with her initials. And the lady that I interviewed just slid down the parkway going the Thousand Island Parkway. And anyway, I went to visit her, and she said there were two things that she can remember specifically about that. One being that there was a gentleman who had to parachute into enemy territory, was taken a prisoner of war, and he sought her out when he was released because he wanted to thank her for folding his parachute properly. So it was, it was successful. But the other one was a tragedy. She said someone died, and her initials were on that parachute, but they did an investigation. And it wasn't the manner in which she folded the parachute. It was that the jumper had not had his safety gear checked. You're supposed to have it checked every single time you skydive. And the harness wasn't hooked up properly. And it was the harness that was at fault to blame for this gentleman's death, not the parachute. But like things like that. You knew that they parachuted out in enemy territory all the time, but you don't think about what's behind the scenes. Who did that? How did they do that? So, yeah. Any other questions?
I can show them your book.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yes.
Well, she's getting your book. I just want to thank you on behalf of the retired women teachers. And I give you that as a thank you. We got all emotional too when you were talking.
Well, I'm glad I'm not alone.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
If you would like one of her books, I have them right over here. They're $25. Cash, please. We have several copies here, and please come on this way if you would like to purchase a book and have it to read.
The one thing that I had thought it was a disappointment was that my